So, let's go. Number 1. The Atacama Skeleton. In 2003, in a dead saltpeter town called La Noria in the Chilean desert, a man named Oscar Munoz untied a purple ribbon from a small white bundle and found a body the size of his own hand. It was 15 centimeters long, head to toe. The skull rose to a hard cone. The ribs seemed to number only 10 pairs instead of the usual 12. It had eye sockets far too large for its face. To anyone holding it, the thing did not look human at all. For years, that is exactly what people said. The little mummy, nicknamed Ata, passed into the hands of a Spanish collector. It became the centerpiece of a 2013 film about unidentified flying objects, presented to audiences as physical proof that we are not alone. The story had everything: a tiny alien preserved in the driest desert on Earth, hidden away by people who did not want the truth known. The Atacama is one of the most arid places on the planet, a landscape so dry that soft tissue can mummify naturally, and that gave the myth a stage. A body preserved for years in that emptiness, cone-headed and hand-sized, was easy to sell as something not of this world. The trouble is that a body cannot argue. It can only be read if someone has the right tools. In 2012, an immunologist at Stanford University named Gary Nolan took an interest. He was not a believer. He simply wanted to know what the DNA would say. His team drilled into the marrow of the ribs and pulled out genetic material, and the first answer arrived quickly. The sample was human. Not only human, but female. The mitochondrial DNA traced back to the west coast of South America, to the very region where Ata was found. The deeper answer came in 2018, in the journal Genome Research, with Atul Butte of the University of California, San Francisco, among the senior authors. Ada's genome carried mutations in at least 7 genes tied to bone growth, genes with names like QL1A1 and FLNB. These are the genes that, when broken, produce skeletal dysplasia, scoliosis, malformed ribs, and abnormal skulls. Ata had not been built by another world. She had been built by a cascade of rare mutations, several of them not seen together before. The apparent 10 pairs of ribs, once waved around as proof of alien anatomy, fell neatly into the same picture, a rib development abnormality rather than a different blueprint. Every feature that had seemed impossible had a human genetic address. Then came the hardest part of the puzzle. The bones looked mature, as if they belonged to a child of 6 or 8 years. Yet the body was the length of a hand. How could both be true? The researchers concluded that Ata was never a child who lived and grew. She was most likely a fetus, premature or stillborn, whose bones carried a growth anomaly that made them read as older than they were. The remains were not ancient either. They were probably only decades old, perhaps a century at most. And so the alien dissolved, and something sadder took its place. Ata was a human daughter, lost before her first breath, wrapped in cloth and left in a desert grave, then dug up and sold and paraded on a screen as a monster. Ethicists, including Bernardo Ariaza and Cian Halcro, said it plainly. This was a miscarriage. It deserved a burial, not a spotlight. Chile opened an inquiry into whether the body had even been legally taken from the country. Here is the strange gift buried in the case. Ata's mutations may teach doctors something real about the genetics of human bone disease. A body that was sold as proof of the impossible turned out to be a lesson about ourselves. And it raises the question that runs through everything that follows. How long can a set of bones lie to us before the right instrument finally makes them tell the truth? Number 2. The Kabwe Broken Hill Skull. In 1921, deep in a lead and zinc mine in what was then northern Rhodesia, a Swiss miner named Tom Spiglar's lamp fell across a heavy, staring skull embedded in the rock. It had a face like a wall of bone, enormous brow ridges, and a brain case that would later measure about 1,300 cubic centimeters. It was one of the first ancient human fossils ever found in Africa. When Arthur Smith Woodward of the Natural History Museum in London described it in 1921, he gave it a brand new name, Homo rhodesiensis. Most researchers today fold it into Homo heidelbergensis, a species that sits close to the ancestry of both Neanderthals and ourselves. And it had a hole in it. The hole sits in the left temple. It is almost perfectly round, about 8 millimeters across, with edges so clean that when people first saw it, one idea leapt to mind. It looked like a bullet wound. From there, the fringe theories wrote themselves. A prehistoric skull, hundreds of thousands of years old, shot through the head by a weapon that should not have existed. Some insisted no natural process could drill a hole so neat. But a bullet does more than punch a hole. Here the story turns, because the evidence a gunshot always leaves is missing. There is no exit wound blown out the other side. There are no cracks radiating from the impact, the way a skull shatters around a high-speed round. Without those signatures, the bullet theory collapses. What remains fits a slower, quieter killer. The mainstream reading is a chronic infection, an abscess or a lesion that ate through the bone over months, and the skull agrees because it is a mouthful of pain. This individual carried some of the oldest dental disease ever documented, at least 10 teeth riddled with cavities and abscesses. That kind of infection does not stay in the mouth. It seeps into the blood, and it kills. The round hole and the rotten teeth may tell one story together, of a man who died slowly of infection, not suddenly of gunfire. Some researchers have even suggested the temple lesion and the dental abscesses were part of the same spreading disease, a single sickness eating through his head from more than one direction. It is a grim picture and a very human one. For nearly a century, no one could even say how old he was. The mine had torn away the layers of earth that normally date a fossil, leaving estimates that ranged wildly. Then, in 2020, a team led by Rainer Grün and Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London published a real number in the journal Nature. Using uranium series and electron spin resonance dating, they placed the skull at about 299,000 years old. Give or take 25,000. That date was a shock, because it was young. Homo heidelbergensis, the species this skull belongs to, was supposed to have vanished earlier. Instead, here it was, alive at the same time as the first members of our own species in Africa. It meant the continent held several kinds of human at once, overlapping, not marching in a tidy line from primitive to modern. The skull still sits in London today, and Zambia has asked for it back. And the bullet myth still circulates online, because a good story dies harder than a bad theory. The truth is quieter. A man with a ruined mouth, 300,000 years ago, is not so different from us. Which brings us to a grave where the wound was not in the body at all, but in what the living did to it afterward. Number 3. The Griswold Vampire. In 1990, some children went sledding down a gravel bank in Griswold, Connecticut, and skulls came tumbling out of the hillside with them. The quarry had cut into a forgotten colonial cemetery, a small family burial ground with about 27 graves. Most held ordinary remains. One did not. Archaeologists labeled it Burial 4. Inside, the bones had been disturbed long after the flesh was gone. Someone had opened the grave years after death, taken the skull and the thigh bones, and arranged them into a skull and crossbones pattern laid across the ribs. Brass tacks on the rotted coffin lid spelled out 3 characters: J, B, and the number 55, initials, and an age. To understand why anyone would rearrange a corpse, you have to understand the terror gripping New England at the time. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was killing whole families. One member would waste away, then another, each seeming to drain the life from the last. With no germ theory and no cure, some communities reached for an older explanation. The dead were feeding on the living. and the way to stop a corpse from feeding was to dig it up and break the pattern, to rearrange the bones so the body could not rise. JB55 was one of those suspected dead. His ribs carry the lesions of chronic pulmonary tuberculosis, the very disease that spread through his community. He was a man of about 55, a poor farmer, his skeleton marked by a life of hard labor. He did not become a monster because he was one. He became a monster because he was sick, and because fear needed a shape. Tuberculosis moved through families the way a curse would, one wasting death after another under the same roof. And without a microscope, no one could see the true culprit. When you cannot see a germ, you look for a body to blame. For decades, he was simply JB55, initials on a coffin. Then, in 2019, scientists, including researchers from the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, took up his case. They used forensic genetic genealogy, comparing Y chromosome DNA from his bones against genealogical records. A probable name emerged: John Barber. A nearby child's grave, marked NB13, may belong to a relative, perhaps a boy named Nathan Barber. The work appeared in the journal Genes, and the original excavation had been led by the Smithsonian's Douglas Owsley. So, the vampire got his name back. He was a farmer and a father figure, and a victim of a disease no one could yet name properly, dug up by neighbors who loved their own dead enough to be afraid of him. It is the clearest physical trace of American vampire folklore ever found, and at its center is not the supernatural, but tuberculosis, and the human habit of building rituals around what we cannot cure. From a body the living feared, we turn now to a body whose own face seems to cry out. Number 4. The Screaming Woman of Deir El-Bahari. In 1935, an expedition working beneath a tomb near Luxor lifted the lid on a burial and found a face locked in a scream. The head was tilted back. The jaw hung wide open, as if the woman had died mid-cry and never stopped. She lay in the chamber of Hat Nufer, the mother of a powerful official named Senmut, which suggested she was family. She wore a black wig of date palm fibers and 2 scarab rings, one gold, one silver. For a long time, the open mouth had a boring explanation. Egyptian embalmers usually tied the jaw shut so the dead would rest with a serene face. This woman's jaw was not tied, so the assumption was simple. The embalmers had been careless, and the mouth had simply fallen open and dried that way. A screaming mummy, the result of a rushed or sloppy job. In 2024, the radiologist Sahar Salim of Cairo University put that assumption to the test, using CT scanning and infrared analysis, and published the results in the journal Frontiers in Medicine. The scans showed a woman who died around 48 years old, standing about 1.54 meters tall, with mild arthritis in her spine and several teeth already lost in life. Her scarab rings and her palm fiber wig helped fix her in the New Kingdom, around the 15th century BCE, and marked her as a woman of some wealth. And then the assumption broke. Because this was not a sloppy mummy at all. If she had been embalmed carelessly, the pivot in the case, the body should have been poorly preserved. Instead, it was superb. The embalmers had used imported juniper resin and frankincense, expensive materials reserved for careful, respectful work. No one who spent that much on preservation would leave the jaw to gape by accident. The careless embalmer story could not survive its own evidence. So Salim offered another explanation, one that turns the scream from a mistake into a witness. The open mouth may be a cadaveric spasm. This is a rare, instantaneous stiffening of the muscles at the exact moment of death, most often when a person dies in extreme physical or emotional agony. If this woman died in that state, and the embalmers reached her before the spasm relaxed, then her final expression would be sealed into her forever. Not sloppiness, a photograph of her last instant. We do not know exactly what killed her, but the scream is no longer an embarrassment for the embalmers. It is a record of a human being who may have died in real pain, more than 3,000 years ago. It is worth saying that this is not the famous screaming mummy, known as Unknown Man E, a different case tied to a palace conspiracy. This is a separate woman, in a separate tomb, whose agony a modern CT scanner finally read correctly, and where forensics found suffering in her face. In the next case, it found something almost impossible hidden inside a knee. Number 5. Usermontu's iron knee pin. In 1995, at a museum in San Jose, California, an X-ray plate lit up with something that did not belong in an ancient body. Running through the left knee of an Egyptian mummy was a straight metal pin, 23 centimeters long, joining the thigh bone to the shin. It looked less like an artifact and more like a piece of modern hardware. The mummy is nicknamed Usermontu, though the name is borrowed. It belongs to the coffin, which was bought separately. The man inside is a mismatch, unidentified, an adult male who was probably of high status, from the New Kingdom or later. His coffin came to the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, and for years no one knew what was inside his knee. When the pin was found, it split opinion instantly. There were two possibilities, and they could not both be true. Either the pin was a modern repair, screwed in by some restorer to hold a fragile leg together, or it was ancient, placed by Egyptian hands thousands of years ago. The stakes were high because a modern pin is a footnote, and an ancient one rewrites what we think Egyptians could do. A 23-centimeter metal rod is not a subtle thing. Whoever put it there, ancient embalmer or modern restorer, knew precisely how a knee joint is built and how to run a pin down the length of the bones. An investigation led by Wilfred Griggs of Brigham Young University, working with radiologists, set out to settle it. They drilled a small sample and studied the pin and the tissue around it, and the bone told on itself. Fused to the metal were ancient resins and organic material, along with traces of fats and textiles that matched Egyptian embalming practice. No modern restorer packs a joint with pharaonic resin. The pin had been placed in antiquity, almost certainly after death, to reattach the leg for burial. What makes it extraordinary is how it was done. The pin runs down the medullary canal, the hollow core of the bone, along the same biomechanical line a surgeon today uses for intramedullary fixation of a fracture. The resin anchoring it works, in principle, like the bone cement that holds a modern implant. Whoever set this pin understood, at some level, how to make metal and bone hold together. It stands among the earliest examples of metal orthopedic hardware ever found in a human body. Debate still lingers over whether this was purely a funerary fix, meant only to make the body whole for the afterlife, or whether it reflects real knowledge of how to repair a joint. The mismatched coffin means we may never know the man's name. But the pin in his knee, reported in 1996, answered its own question. Ancient, not a hoax. Hands from 2,600 years ago solved a problem your orthopedic surgeon still faces today. From metal hidden in bone, we move to a mistake hidden in plain sight, in a glass museum case, for 80 years. Number 6. The Magdalenian Girl. For most of a century, visitors to the Field Museum in Chicago stood before a glass case and read a tragic little story. Inside lay the skeleton of a teenage girl who died in the Ice Age, 15 or 16 years old, one of the most complete ancient human skeletons in any museum. Her name on the label was the Magdalenian Girl. There was only one problem. She was not a girl. The skeleton was dug up in 1911 near Cap Blanc in the Dordogne region of France, and belongs to the Magdalenian culture, roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years old. The Field Museum acquired it in 1926. The age estimate, the teenage label, rested almost entirely on her wisdom teeth. They had not come through the gums, and unerupted wisdom teeth usually mean a young person whose mouth has not finished growing. In 2006, a team led by the Field Museum anthropologist Robert Martin decided to look closer, with tools that did not exist in 1911. They put the skull through a CT scanner and looked inside the jaw. What they found quietly demolished the story. The wisdom teeth had full roots. They were not waiting to erupt because she was young. They were impacted, wedged in, and unable to come through, which is extremely common in fully grown adults. Once that pillar fell, the rest of the skeleton was reread. The fusion of her bones, the wear on her joints, the pattern of her cranial sutures, all pointed not to a teenager, but to an adult somewhere between 25 and 40, likely toward the older end. The girl was a mature woman, possibly middle-aged. Her sex, at least, held up. The pelvis confirmed she was female. The Magdalenian people she belonged to were among the great hunter-gatherers of the Ice Age, the culture that painted cave walls and carved fine tools from bone and antler. She was not a fragile innocent frozen in youth, but an adult who had lived a full and difficult life among them. She had also lived with real pain. Her jaw showed significant dental disease, abscesses, and tooth loss, the kind of chronic infection that would have ached for years. The Field Museum, to its credit, announced the correction and renamed the specimen to reflect that she was an adult. Nearly 80 years of captions, textbooks, and school visits had all repeated an error that a single scan overturned. There is a lesson in that case, beyond the bones. A treasured object, studied by experts, displayed to millions, can carry a wrong story for a lifetime simply because no one looked inside. It took non-destructive imaging, the ability to see through bone without breaking it, to give this woman back her real age and her real biography. And from a museum caption that was wrong for 80 years, we go to a burial that was right about something we did not expect the Ice Age to understand at all. Number 7. Romito II. In a cave in Calabria, in the far south of Italy, two skeletons lie together beneath a boulder carved with the image of a wild bull. They are locked in what looks like an embrace. One of them is a young woman. The other is a young man, about 17 years old, and he stood barely a meter tall. This is Romito II, from the Grotta del Romito, first excavated in the 1960s by Paolo Graziosi, and later studied by teams from the University of Florence. The burial dates to the late Upper Paleolithic, around 10,000 to 11,000 years ago. The young man's forearms and lower legs are dramatically shortened, out of proportion with the rest of his body. The diagnosis is acromesomelic dysplasia, a rare inherited form of dwarfism that shrinks the middle and end segments of the limbs. He is the earliest known case of dwarfism in the entire human fossil record, and in the world he lived in, that was not a minor thing. His short limbs would have made it hard to run, hard to hunt, hard to keep pace with a group that survived by moving and chasing and enduring. In a harsh Ice Age landscape, a person who cannot run is a person who needs others to survive. And survive he did to 17, which tells us something the bones alone almost whisper. Isotopic and skeletal evidence shows he was fed and cared for. His group did not abandon him. They carried a member who could not fully carry himself through years of scarcity in one of the earliest pieces of evidence we have for social care of the disabled. His condition was congenital, present from birth, not the result of hunger or injury. Researchers including David Freyer of the University of Kansas examined his skull and inner ear to rule out other disorders, and the diagnosis held. Acromesomelic dysplasia would not have touched his mind or shortened his natural lifespan on its own. It shaped his limbs, and it made him dependent on the goodwill of the people around him, and those people did not fail him. Then there is the burial itself. He was laid to rest, embracing a young woman, Romito I, the two of them together beneath a stone engraved with an oryx, in a cave that holds some of the finest Paleolithic engravings in Italy. Whoever buried him did not treat him as a burden to be forgotten. They gave him a place, a partner in death, and a marked grave. We often imagine prehistoric life as pure brutality. every mouth judged by what it could bring in. Romito too says otherwise. 10,000 years ago, being different did not automatically mean being left behind. Someone made sure this young man ate. Someone held him as he was buried. And that quiet fact, read out of shortened bones, may be one of the oldest proofs of human compassion we possess. From care written into a grave, we turn to a disease we thought belonged only to our own age, found in a bone almost 2 million years old. Number 8. The Swartkrans Toe. On a scanning stage in Johannesburg, a single small foot bone glows under a micro CT beam, and inside it is something that should not be there. A tumor. The bone is a metatarsal, catalogued as SK7923 from the Swartkrans Cave in South Africa, inside the fossil region known as the cradle of humankind. It is about 1.7 million years old. The bone likely belonged to an early hominin, perhaps Paranthropus robustus, or an early member of our own genus, one of the creatures that used that cave in the early Pleistocene. For over 1 million years, it sat in the rock, an ordinary-looking foot bone. Then, in 2016, a team led by Edward Oades and Patrick Randolph-Quinney of the University of the Witwatersrand scanned it in high resolution and published what they saw in the South African Journal of Science. The imaging revealed a mass of disorganized, spiky bone erupting from the metatarsal. It was an osteosarcoma, an aggressive malignant bone cancer. And with that diagnosis, the bone became the oldest confirmed case of malignant cancer in the human lineage. This is the hinge that matters, because we tell ourselves a comforting story about cancer. We call it a modern disease, a product of pollution, processed food, and long lifespans. This footbone says that story is wrong. Cancer was here before we were even human. Osteosarcoma today most often strikes children and young adults, and it struck a hominin 1.7 million years ago, causing pain and making every step harder. The same research group also found a benign tumor, an osteoid osteoma, in an even older Australopithecus child from the nearby site of Sterkfontein, close to 2 million years old. Disease of the growing bone is not new. It is ancient. 2 separate tumors, one benign and one malignant, in 2 different early human relatives, both close to 2 million years old, is not a coincidence. It is a signal that these afflictions were already part of the package long before agriculture, cities, or industry. Getting to that conclusion took real care. A malignant tumor in a fossil has to be separated from ordinary post-mortem damage, from cracks, from infection, from the countless ways bone can be marred over 1 million years underground. Micro-CT let the researchers see the internal architecture of the growth, the telltale spiculated pattern of malignancy, and oncologists and radiologists were brought in to confirm the diagnosis against modern clinical cases. What the Swartkrans Toe finally settled is a matter of framing that touches every one of us. Cancer is not a punishment invented by the modern world. It is a deep-time companion of the multicellular body, a flaw woven into the same biology that lets us grow at all. Our ancestors carried it before they carried fire. From a disease that has always been with us, we turn to a piece of ancient medicine that fought back and gave a woman her stride again. Number 9. The Cairo Toe. In a tomb near Luxor, on the mummified foot of a woman named Tabaketen Mut, sits a carved wooden toe, laced onto her foot with cord, shaped and colored to look like the real thing. It is a prosthesis made of wood and leather, and it may be the oldest functional artificial limb in the world. Tabaketen Mut was the daughter of a priest, and she lived roughly between 950 and 710 BCE, in the period Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period. She had lost her right big toe, likely to amputation after gangrene, possibly a complication of diabetes. In its place, someone built her a replacement. The device, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is older than another famous early prosthesis, the Griswold Toe, made of cartilage. What lifts the Cairo Toe above a mere burial ornament is the evidence that she actually used it. The toe shows wear, the marks of real use in life, not the pristine surface of something made only for the grave. It had been refitted at least 3 times, carefully reshaped to match her changing foot. And it was built with a hinged, jointed design that let it flex, the way a real toe bends when you push off the ground to take a step. That detail matters more than it sounds. The big toe carries a surprising share of your body weight and does much of the work of pushing off with every stride. Lose it, and walking becomes a genuine struggle. So the question was whether this wooden toe truly helped or just filled the gap for appearance. Around 2011, the Egyptologist Jackie Finch of the University of Manchester set out to answer it properly. Finch built exact replicas of the toe and recruited volunteers who were missing that same toe. She had them wear the replicas, walking in reproductions of ancient Egyptian sandals, through a biomechanics laboratory that measured their gait. The results showed the prosthesis meaningfully improved how they walked, restoring comfort and a more natural stride. This was not decoration. It was a working prosthetic limb, predating even the Roman metal leg found at Kabwe that had long been called among the earliest. To make it work, the maker had to understand the mechanics of a foot, the way the toe joint bends and bears load at the moment of push-off, and then reproduce that motion in wood and leather. That is not folkcraft. That is applied anatomy. There is one more layer to it. Egyptian belief held that the body had to be whole to enter the afterlife, so a missing toe was a spiritual problem as much as a practical one. The craftsman who made this toe was solving both at once, restoring her walk in life and her wholeness in death. It is a reminder that ancient medicine was not only about survival. It cared about walking, about comfort, about dignity. And from a woman who was helped to walk, we end with a king who was found beneath a parking space. Number 10. Richard III. In 2012, in the city of Leicester, an archaeologist's trowel scraped away the soil under a painted line in a council car park, and a curved spine came into the light. It belonged to a man who had been buried in a grave too short for his body, without ceremony, more than 500 years earlier. It would turn out to be a king. Richard III was King of England from 1483 until his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. He was the last Plantagenet, the last English king to die in battle, cut down as Henry Tudor took the crown. His body was reportedly buried at the Greyfriars Friary in Leicester. Then Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. The friary was torn down, and the location of the grave was lost for centuries. In 2012, the University of Leicester, driven by the Looking for Richard project and the researcher Philippa Langley, dug into the car park built over the friary's footprint. On the very first day, they found a skeleton. Its spine bore a severe idiopathic scoliosis, a sideways S-curve that had developed during adolescence. It would have raised one shoulder higher than the other, but it was not the grotesque hunchback of Tudor propaganda. The bones matched a man who could ride and fight, not a cripple. For centuries, Tudor writers and later Shakespeare had painted him as a twisted villain, his deformity a mark of his soul. The skeleton told a more honest story, a real curvature that he had hidden well enough under armor to lead men into battle to the very end. The manner of his death was written across the skeleton. There were 10 wounds inflicted at or near the time of death, 8 of them to the skull, the kind of injuries a man suffers when he has lost his helmet and is surrounded. 2 blows to the base of the skull from a weapon like a halberd or a sword would each have been fatal. Radiocarbon dating placed the death squarely in the late 15th century. Then came the proof that turned a likely case into a certainty. In 2013, The geneticist Turi King of the University of Leicester led an effort to match mitochondrial DNA from the skeleton to living descendants down the maternal line, including a man named Michael Ibsen. It matched. Combined with the osteology, the radiocarbon date, and the historical record, the identification was beyond reasonable doubt. Isotopes in his bones even showed a shift to richer food and more wine late in his life, and analysis found he had carried a roundworm infection. He was reburied with honor in Leicester Cathedral in 2015. A broken back, a lost grave, 5 centuries of silence, and modern science still dragged the whole truth into daylight. Step back from these 10 bodies, and the same handful of tools keeps reappearing. CT scanning, micro-CT, DNA, isotope analysis, radiometric dating. These are the instruments that turned a century of guesses into answers, and each one did a particular kind of work. CT scanning let researchers look inside a body without destroying it. It read the cadaveric spasm in the screaming woman and exposed the impacted wisdom teeth that had aged the Magdalenian Girl wrongly for 80 years. Micro-CT went smaller still, revealing the malignant architecture of the tumor hidden in the Swartkrans footbone. DNA gave names back to the nameless, turning JB55 into John Barber, and confirming that a skeleton under a car park was truly a king. Radiometric dating fixed ages. The ground had scrambled, pinning the Kabwe skull at 299,000 years. And genomics killed a myth outright, because Ada was never an alien. Look at the pattern, and it is always the same. An old caption, a piece of folklore, or a simple fear stood where the evidence should have been. Sloppy embalmers, a doomed teenage girl, a cancer that only the modern world could produce, a vampire. Each one was replaced with something truer and often more human. The bodies did not change. Our ability to read them did. Several of these cases revealed not horror, but care and skill. The metal pin set in Usermontu's knee. The wooden toe rebuilt 3 times for Tabaketenmut. The Ice Age group that fed Romito II for 17 years. Others revealed that suffering we think of as modern, cancer, and chronic infection is written deep into our lineage. And the fear-driven ritual of a vampire reburial turned out to be a community's honest response to a disease it had no way to cure. The most important part is that the tools are no longer rare. Scanners and DNA labs are now within reach of museums around the world, which means countless skeletons sitting in glass cases have never been properly examined. Every one of them is a sealed record, a life compressed into bone, waiting for the right instrument. The same methods that named Richard III are used today to identify fallen soldiers, disaster victims, and modern cold cases. The line between prehistoric medicine and modern forensics is thinner than it looks. It is worth noticing how often the answer was not a new dig, but a new look at an old specimen. Ata, the Magdalenian Girl, the Screaming Woman, Usermontu, the Swartkrans Toe, all had been sitting in collections for years, even decades, before anyone pointed the right machine at them. The discovery was not in the ground. It was in the asking. The dead keep their secrets only until the technology catches up. Even a solved case leaves something behind. We know the Screaming Woman probably died in agony, but we still do not know exactly what killed her. We know the pin in Usermontu's knee is ancient, but not whether it reflects true surgical knowledge or only a careful funerary repair. Ada's mutations are real, but not fully understood. And the Kabwe bullet myth still spreads, proof that a solved fact does not always defeat a good story. There is an ethical weight here too. These were people, not exhibits. Ita was a lost daughter. The Kabwe skull and others sit far from home, and questions of repatriation hang over them. Forensics does more than deliver facts. At its best, it restores dignity and identity, handing a stranger back their own story. To solve a body is to say, this was a person, and here is what happened to them. A miscarried daughter, a farmer feared as a vampire, a woman who died screaming, a boy who could not run and was loved anyway. These were not specimens. They were lives, and the scanner simply gave them back their voices. That is the thread running through all 10. What we call impossible is often just unscanned. Every mystery solved makes the next one look answerable. Somewhere, in a museum near you, a skeleton with a wrong label is waiting for someone to look inside. These 10 bodies were liars only until we learned to listen, and the instruments keep getting better, which means the graves will keep talking. If the deep past still has questions for you, there is another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.